Hey yogis, welcome to my channel. My name is Kassandra and today I'm taking you through a chair pose tutorial. Everyone's favorite, right? Probably not. Every time I ask students what their least favorite pose is, chair pose is always like in the top 3. People just really don't seem to enjoy being in it. I do believe that it's good to do those poses that we want to avoid and that we have a lot of resistance towards. That's where we can really experience a lot of growth. And I'm not talking about, physical growth of getting stronger or more flexible, although that's wonderful. I'm really talking about the mental growth that comes from doing something you don't want to do. So first thing, chair pose. There's a decision point that needs to happen right away. You'll probably notice that some teachers like to introduce the pose with the feet parallel, hip width distance apart. This is really wonderful, especially for those of you who tend to have issues with your hips, with your knees, or with your ankles. It's a more accessible version of chair pose, I would say. And just notice if you tend to have your toes pointing out, if they're pointing forward. Often we'll try to point them inwards slightly so that the outside edges of your feet are aligned with the edges of your mat. So truly parallel. When you do this, what we're looking for here is engagement through the foundation of your feet. So you're lifting up through the arches, spreading and lifting through the toes. And then you want to make sure that your knees are not buckling in towards one another. So this is the challenge for those of you who like to do chair pose with your feet hip width distance apart. Number one thing I see happen when students do this one with this variation is as soon as they bend the knees are collapsing in. So there's out, in, out happening, which is pretty much a recipe for disaster. So those of you who are keeping this wider stance, you actively need to imagine that you're pushing against something. I really like to work with resistance even when there is none. So at the same time, imagine that your teacher had their hands on the outside edges of your knees and you had to actively push against their palm with resistance. And you can even practice this yourself when you're on your mat, just physically pushing your hands against your thighs and your knees and actively working on pushing your knees into the hands. You'll feel your glutes turn on right away, which is what we want. At the same time, there's a light squeezing action and activation through the inner thighs, which is why sometimes we'll do a chair pose with a block in between the upper inner thighs as a way to engage through the adductors. So this is option 1 with your feet wide as your hip bones. The reason I'm specifying hip bones is that sometimes when I'm, teaching a public class, I'll tell my students feet hip width distance apart. And because maybe the outer edges of their hips are wide, they go and they widen their stance. But that's not really what hip width distance apart means. I'm really talking about your bones. So not the tissue that is surrounding your bones. So it's really just about hip bones, knees, and ankles all in one line. The other way that you can place your feet, this is the way that I normally tend to do it, is to bring my big toes together to touch, and then my heels are about 1 inch apart. This is a slight pigeon toe heel, which some people call it like pigeon toe with your feet, but all it means is that the outer edges, again, of my feet are perfectly flush and in line and parallel to the edges of the mat. So that when I do bend into my chair pose, now the entire, pretty much like everything along the inner leg is hugging into the midline. So this is a different activation. With this one, I'm not so much concerned with the resistance out. I'm more so trying to engage and activate the resistance in. So a squeezing in. Both are great options. I would say this one, if you have any kind of knee issues, stick with this one. Otherwise, if it feels pretty good to you, you can play around with having your big toes together, heels about 1 inch apart. Okay, once we have our foundation, I'll move up the body. So regardless of the one that you want to choose, we are evenly distributing the weight through all 4 corners of both feet, actively lifting and spreading through the toes, strong foundation. As we bend, this is where things tend to fall apart a little bit. What I don't want is for all of your body weight to shift forward into the balls of your feet. For this one, I'd rather have most of your weight back into your heels. This is one way that we get to activate the posterior chain through the legs, so the muscles in the glutes, in the hamstrings, and a little bit into your calves. And now as you lower down, normally what I like to do is that if I look down, I just want to see the very tip of my toes, no more than that. If you can't see your toes, you've shifted your weight too far forward. You need to shift it back slightly. And of course, you can lower down much more than this, but here's the main thing that tends to go wrong in chair pose. And I'll just lift because it's easier to show you guys this way. So what I'm very guilty of is this. So there's an exaggeration of the lumbar curve, and we kind of let our belly out, right? So we kind of just flop into our chair pose and wonder why it doesn't feel so good. So instead, from the foundation, you want to lengthen your tailbone down and draw the navel up and back. Strong core activation. From here, as I start to sink down, what I don't want is to tilt the tailbone up. I'm still lengthening down, still strong and engaged. Weight is back into my heels, and I sit down. Because my big toes are together for this version, I'm working on hugging into the midline as I sink down lower. Maybe the hands are at the heart. Maybe the arms are parallel to the floor, adding some intensity. Maybe they reach up overhead. This is the hardest part for me of mobility. Like in my entire body, the least amount of flexibility that I have is in the top of my shoulders. It's very hard for me to reach my arms up overhead without flaring my ribs open. So you'll notice in my classes, whenever I'm doing chair pose, I'm very rarely able to get my arms higher than this amount. At home, you might have more range of motion than I do here. Every body is different. You might be able to reach your arms up overhead and having your biceps in line with your ears. If you are able to get your arms up, be careful with the rib cage and with your upper back. It's not just the low back that tends to curve too much. We'll also sometimes experience it by puffing the chest forward. So for me, I avoid this by keeping my arms a little bit more at eye level height as opposed to aligned with my ears. Lengthen tailbone down, draw the navel in, weight back into the heels, sinking as low as I possibly can, squeezing in through the midline and reaching up through the arms or maybe even hands at your heart. So I hope you find this helpful. One last thing that you could do with your chair pose would be to practice it with a block in the upper inner thighs with your feet hip width distance apart, outer edges of your feet parallel to the shorter edges of your mat or longer edges of your mat, and then really working on squeezing your block without collapsing the knees, turning on and engaging through your adductors, lengthening tailbone down, drawing your belly in, making sure the ribs are not flaring, and then finding that alignment and sinking as low as you can possibly go. If you look down, you want to be able to see just the tips of your big toes, and maybe you get lower and lower. It doesn't matter. You don't need to go very low in this one in order to feel the muscles engage. This is a great pose to build up strength in your quads, but not just your quads, also in your hamstrings as well as your glutes. And if you're in it long enough, you'll even feel it in your ankles a little bit and in your calves. So play around with it. Let me know how it goes. And if you guys want more pose tutorials, leave me a comment below to see which others you would like me to take you through. And I'll post links to all the other tutorials I've done so far. Thank you so much. Namaste.